I'm very impressed with the number of people who came to this storytelling event. And this is what we want it to be. We want it to be something that you enjoy very much. And Bill Pereira will start first and give you a picture of early history.
I appreciate the opportunity to appear before such a distinguished audience, and I want to compliment you on your choice of a place to live. And here's why. Back to the beginning. Picture this: a wilderness. No lake, just the river. A trackless wilderness. The Indians didn't live here. Nobody lived here. The Long Hunters, 2.5 centuries ago, came through the dangerous, dark, and bloody ground of Kentucky. They came here hunting the buffalo and the deer, which were the first commerce of this area. They came through Kentucky and they came down a creek valley. They looked out over this valley spread before them, the valley of Station Camp Creek, and it must have looked like an Eden to them. They had water, rich land, and as they came south, they struck a buffalo path and they established their station camp, which was a staging depot for their commerce, which were their skins. And that station camp is right below Kroger's, and you'll see a small spring issuing out into the creek just south of Nashville Pike off Cage's Bend Road. There were two of them, Caspar Mansker and Isaac Bledsoe, long hunters, experienced woodsmen. They knew they were on an important buffalo trace. The buffalo were the first road makers, because whereas you see buffalo out west going in massed herds, here they couldn't do that because of the trees. They went head to tail and made narrow, dark, deep cuts. Caspar Mansker went west. Isaac Bledsoe went east. Mansker established a farm and a fort in Goodlettsville at the big lick down there. Isaac Bledsoe established a fort at Castellan Springs, or at Bledsoe's Lick, and there were ample buffalo and deer for all of them. They were the first. In 1780, James Robertson and the others came after, and you've all read that story. But as relates to Fairvue, Fairvue was always the center. That Buffalo Road runs between here and Nashville Pike, a few hundred yards south of Nashville Pike. And there are remnants of it today that you can see. Crosses Station Camp Creek at Billy Dick Brown's, crosses the other branch of Station Camp down here behind Frank G. The evidences are still there. So this was the central road of Middle Tennessee, east to west. Because a fort in the middle of it was the home of William Asher, they called it Asher's Trace. So Asher's Trace was Middle Tennessee's main road, and it went right through Fairvue. Later, in 1788, the beleaguered settlers here, who were not welcome guests of the Indians who hunted in this territory, decided they needed more reinforcements. So they built a road to the east, to Knoxville, straight over Cumberland Mountain. And in 1788, the first convoy of travelers came right along this road in front of Fairvue. And one member of that convoy was a fiery young lawyer by the name of Andrew Jackson. He's first settled at Rivergate, where he moved in with the widow Donaldson because she needed protection from the Indians. She also had a daughter who thought that she wasn't married, and so he courted Rachel at that time and met her there. He later established a law office, a general store, and a cotton gin at Gallatin, and he went back and forth Asher's Trace many times. It was now called the Road to the Holston. The next group that came were not interested in hides, they were interested in land and cotton and commerce, because Fairvue had something in abundance that very few other farms had. It had access to the river. Picture, if you will, that wilderness. Think of trying to navigate an ox cart across it to New Orleans or to Nashville for that reason, and trying to sell your cotton and your corn. It was worthless until you could get some currency, which was then gold, Spanish gold. But we had the river currents, which would take you downriver to Nashville, all the way down to New Orleans, without any cost of sail or power. The Franklins were the first family to take advantage of that. James Franklin built the place where Bill Golden lives, and his son, Isaac Franklin, built this house. Isaac was one of the largest, he and his partner Armfield, slave traders in America. By 1832, slave trading was becoming disreputable and illegal in many places, and he was trying to get out of the business. He wanted to shed the image of being a slave trader because that was a disreputable, if profitable, occupation. So he concentrated on farming, and with his own bondservants here, he sent his produce, his corn and his hogs and his cattle downriver, where he had a number of large plantations in Louisiana. One where the famous prison is down there now. He had 3 or 4 large plantations. So he would supply not the cotton, but the food. Cotton was the money crop. Half the traffic going down the Mississippi in these years was cotton, because it was a new fabric and it was revolutionary. Now, Isaac, in 1832, you've all heard the story about how Adelicia came here to visit a relative in Gallatin, stopped in a storm, came in the house for shelter, fell in love with the house. Hadn't met Isaac Franklin, but determined to marry the man that owned it. So all this is, hey, it happens. So she did, and they had a life together here, and they had 4 children. But Isaac died while in Louisiana. His body was shipped back home in a casket of alcohol, whiskey or brandy, whatever it was, and he was buried in a tomb out here. He died, and they erected an elaborate tomb, and his 4 children died. Adelicia got her money and cut, and she was at one time reputed to be one of the richest women in the world, because Walter will tell you how she managed to get her gold to London in the Civil War. And with that, I'll turn it to Walter for the next chapter.
Okay, we have Adelicia married and widowed, and we have Fairvue, the mansion house, standing then, empty, and it is still standing today. Adelicia was a remarkable woman. Her second marriage was to an Acklin in Nashville, and together they built Belmont. And the beautiful Belmont mansion is right in the middle of Belmont University campus, preserved today and interpreted for its historical significance in Tennessee. It's hard to talk about Fairvue, which is a plantation, without talking in terms of plantations and slaves and slavery and human bondage. I despise those terms in the sense that what they represented. I can't imagine owning some of you. I can't imagine some of you owning me and trading back and forth. The practice of slavery was abominable to us today, because in those days it was an accepted practice. But the reality is that slavery existed. Slaves lived on this land. Slaves built this plantation. Slaves built the mansion house. There's no way to deny it. The plantation existed then, and it was, as a plantation, it was one of the most important and imposing plantations in the Upper South. So we moved then into the post Isaac Franklin era. He had been with John Armfield, probably the largest slave trader in the southeastern U.S. They bought slaves in Virginia and transported them by their own shipping, ocean-going shipping, to New Orleans, and then marketed them in New Orleans to cotton producers in Mississippi and to cane producers in Louisiana. It was enormous and sordid business, and one with which he tried to disassociate himself shortly before he died. But I suppose that it would be hard to disassociate yourself with such a practice, certainly it seems to us today. Alicia inherited Fairvue, then sold it, and later bought it back. She was a first-class operator. During the Civil War, the house was abandoned, and she still owned it, and so she came out and hosted a couple of balls and dances and evening parties, dinner parties for Union Army officers. She was a Southern woman, but she understood that we were an occupied state at that time, or occupied county, and she knew that she had to play ball with the people in power because she had cotton that needed to get to New Orleans and needed to get through the blockade to England, because England was the world's largest cotton market, and there they could transfer funds to the United States, and she could go north and claim the funds, which she did. She got the cotton out, and the money was sent to New York, and she went there and picked it up, and then came back south. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate armies passed over through and over this plantation. Both confiscated anything they needed. Both armies lived heavily off the land. The Southern Army particularly lived heavily off the land. And so if anything you had in the way of silage or forage, anything you had in the way of poultry or cattle or hogs, it was susceptible to being taken. Sometimes you were given a receipt for it. The Federal Army was real good at giving receipts, and most of them were redeemed. The Confederate Army was less good at giving receipts because I think the guys doing the confiscation knew that they were not going to be redeemed because there was no system set up in the Southern Army to pay off if they had taken Farmer Jones' milk cow. There was no way that Farmer Jones could do anything about it, just hope that he would have better luck next time. So that was a dim and dismal era for Fairvue, as it was for the South and Nashville and Tennessee throughout. Ultimately, Charles Reed of New York City, a professional gambler and a successful one, bought Fairvue in the late 1800s. And his idea was to make it a farm, a horse breeding farm, to breed thoroughbreds that he could sell at Saratoga and some of the big auctions in the East. And so he bought Fairvue. He tore down the brick wall around the garden and much of the house and used those bricks to build the mare barns that line the street, those little barns coming in, where mares were kept, and their stallion boyfriends were brought by in the hope that something good would happen for Mr. Reed. The Reeds lived a good and glorious life here. But things went bad for them ultimately, and they left Galton, and Fairvue went back to the ownership of a Franklin, but not of the Franklin family that Isaac was, but for Franklin in the east of us here, I think. I've forgotten which county, but 100 miles or so east of here. And he owned the property. Into the early 1900s, Mr. Jim Weems of Gallatin, who was a brother of Mr. Weems, who owned Fairvue more recently, bought the property, but he didn't do anything much with it. He worked, he had the farm worked, ran some cattle and raised some tobacco, but the house was in virtually a ruin. And I remember seeing it in that condition when I was a young child, 8 or 9 years old. About the mid-1930s, he sold it to his brother Bill, Will Weems. And Will and Ellen Weems then became the owners of Fairvue. Ellen single-handedly almost restored the house. She had been involved in restoring Andrew Jackson's Hermitage in Nashville as a member of the Ladies' Hermitage Organization. So she knew a lot of the pitfalls that go with restoration. And she and her husband had the resources to do it. So there was no problem about borrowing money from the bank or anybody else. They had the money in hand. She showed me one day on the 3rd floor in the attic several inscriptions on the wall written by Union soldiers, giving their names and the date that they were at Fairvue. So not only the officers had dances downstairs, but the enlisted men, sometime or other, were in the house and left their dresses on the wall on the 3rd floor. In 1929, when the Great Depression broke out and nearly ruined the country, 2 Nashville men, one Nashville man, Roger Scalwell, and the Foxland Hall owner, John M. Branham, got together, and with a man named Thomas from New York who had a kennel of foxhounds. And they decided that they would try to organize, they would acquire Fairvue property and additional properties and organize the Southern Grasslands Hunt and Racing Foundation for fox hunting, riding to the hounds. They hoped they'd have aquatic sports. They hoped to have almost any kind of equine sports that involved horses. And suddenly the charter was issued by the state, and all of a sudden the Grasslands Foundation was started. They quickly acquired by purchase or lease about 28 square miles of land between Gallatin and Hendersonville, all south of the Highway 31E. Ultimately, they were unable to pay for the land they acquired, but they were able to use it for a couple of years. And in those 2 years, they organized and staged the first 2 international steeplechases ever held in North America. They were held here within sight of where we are, just beyond the mansion house. Those steeplechases attracted attention from all over the world. The cup for the first chase was given by the King of Spain, whose idea of fun was not horse riding, but his idea of fun was to close out streets off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Manila, in the capital city of Spain. And he would get out his sports car, and he would race up and down the streets by himself in his sports car. That was his idea of fun, but he claimed to like horse racing too, and he gave the the first trophy for the first steeplechase here. The railroad put in a new siding at near St. Blaise called the Payton siding, so that Eastern sports people could come down to the races in their own private rail cars. They didn't have to worry about hotels in Nashville or the non-existence almost of hotels in Gallatin. And so it was a big occasion. The big ball that was held in the house the night before the race was a big occasion, written about in all the newspapers in Nashville and memorialized in a number of books and articles that have been written since by people who attended. And I remember one woman from the north was saying, riding home after, I don't know where home was, but they must have rented a house in the neighborhood. That happened a lot. That she thought she'd been in a dream world, she'd been in Fairvue, that the whole experience was just magnificent, and she knew that she would never see anything like it, and she probably didn't. So it was like a number of other things. It was too good to be true, and when the notes came due for the land, the Fairvue, Gressons couldn't pay off, and so they sold the land, and the original owners bought it back because they had bought it back cheaper than they'd sold it. So they didn't suffer much. They suffered 2 years' loss of farm production, but they didn't suffer much. Half a dozen merchants in Gallatin lost some money because they had extended credit to Grasslands, but none of them was severely hurt. And some of you remember the old Gallatin Buggy and Implement Company in Gallatin, and an ancient hardware store, but they were too careful to extend the credit very far, and they sold more and lost less than any other of the Gallatin merchants. But so the Fairvue thing the Grasslands thing is a memory. It was built around Fairvue. They acquired Fairvue as the first tract, and then they bought other lands. They didn't buy Foxland Hall because Mr. Brown and his wife didn't want to sell it, but he was involved in the Grasslands project. So he gave Grasslands permission to hunt on his land. And he remained an active member of the board of Grasslands. Two quick things and I'll wind up, believe it or not. The editor of the Chicago Tribune and the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, the publisher of the Louisville Courier Journal were both members of Grasslands. They both put money in it. In addition, both of them made loans to Grasslands when things got going badly. And they really thought Grasslands was great, but they have two different reasons to appreciate Grasslands. One, Mr. McCormick in Chicago hated England and anything English. And so he thought, we are going to have a better race course at Grasslands than the English have anywhere. And we're going to show them up and make them look like Ned and the Second Reader. Well, the publisher of the Courier Journal was an Anglophile. He loved anything English. He had even imported English servants to work in his home near Louisville, out on the road to Cincinnati, on the Ohio River. So he was so proud that they were doing the Queen an honor by having Grasslands. And so you have these two different men. One hated the English, one loved it and imitated the English, but they found their common denominator in a love of horses here at Grasslands. Those are great periods in the history of Grasslands. And now, John, you can crank up. John has the stories to tell.
All right. All right, he's given me the job of telling you about more of the present time. I'm the kid that was born the year that Henry Ford made the last Model T Ford. And by the way, by the time I was 14, I had one and I drove it everywhere. But this part of the country changed so drastically after the big Depression. The Weems brought in sometime in the early 30s a shoe factory to Gallatin that worked 500 in 2 shoe factories in Gallatin. You can imagine a town of 11,000 having 1,000 people working in one company. But anyway, Gallatin grew, and we now are protecting that little village that those people making $30 a week built houses and lived comfortably and right after the Depression. Now, along came the war, the Second World War. The First World War was to solve all the problems of the world. It didn't. 25 years later, the Second World War came, and this country here was covered with the maneuvers. They were men in here from all over the United States. Lots and lots of people, young men from the north and south were in here tearing up the fences, scaring the cattle and shooting, and tanks running all over the place. And so this was and I was a kid on the side of the road watching them go by, talking to these young men from all over the United States. One morning I woke up and went out in the front yard with 2 men laying there. One of them's name was Lucerno. I assumed that he was Italian. And he was laying out there in the front yard, and I asked him, what was he doing? He said, I'm dead. So, long about late in the evening, they were still laying there. They'd been killed, and so they were laying there. And so my mother says, go get them and bring them in to eat. And that's the way this part of the country was in those days. And the maneuvers went through, and then these young men that were in this area were the first to land at Omaha Beach and those beaches. And a lot of them met and married young women here in this county. And it was a great time when the war was over and came back, and they came back. I'd like to tell you about the industrial area of Gallatin, and sometime about 1950, 49 or 50, I got married and moved to Hendersonville. 800 people were living in Hendersonville at the time. And I came back to Gallatin because all my work was back this way. I had tried to go to Vanderbilt University, and I found out that I wasn't. Universities, I couldn't make it. I just couldn't make it. And I told my partner, I am going to quit at Christmas time. I said, I think I can make a living. And I did, and I struggled, and I made a living. And so I've enjoyed being part of the growth of Sumner County in the last 50, 60, 70 years. There is a museum in Gallatin that tells you can see the artifacts from the beginning that he tells you about, the surveying instruments, the land grant deeds and the silver coins that came back from New Orleans when they flatboated down the Mississippi to take their products down there. He failed to tell you what those products were. This part of the country with its flat land and river bottoms would raid corn 10 feet high. Well, I'm just maybe 6 feet. All right. Anyway, there was lots of corn. Corn was a major product. Cotton might have been later on, but corn was the major product. first it fed hogs, and you had hog meat, and everybody liked hog meat, and you could ship it down to New Orleans after salting it down and sell it down there, and you could send a little corn down there and sell it. But the main product that they sent down the river was in a barrel. And it was nothing more than white corn whiskey, and it sold well. And they came back, the Natchez Trace, after buying a horse and loading the horse down with the things they needed, such as sugar and spices and other things that they couldn't get back here in the frontier, cloth and so forth, and came back up the Natchez Trace with a few silver coins. Those silver coins in the museum are there for you to see, that they found at the fort sites. Some of them cut into little pieces like this. The coin had no value as a coin, but the value was in the silver in the coin. So if you worked a week for me, I'd just cut you off a piece of that coin and give it to you, and that would be your pay. But anyway, the museum has all of these items in it that you can see today, and I hope that you'll get a chance to go up there. This plantation here was covered up with those maneuvers. Long about 1950, the plans had been laid out to build a dam down toward Hendersonville called the Old Hickory Dam and back the water up all over this land. Mr. Weems had something over 500 acres here, and about 150 or so of it was in the watershed. And when the water came up, it covered up the lowlands. And so Mr. Weems, being as important a man as he was, got on the train and went to Washington, D.C., got to the right people, and told them that he wanted to raise the land that you see down here where the swimming pool is, up to a level that they would not take the land, and to build a concrete fence across his dam to protect his little lake from boaters. And they gave him that right. Nobody else got that. He had that much influence. The land was raised, the dike was built across there, and Mr. Weems lived on here for a long period of time after that. He was an interesting man. He was a salesman that nobody else could beat. He sold the shoes that made the German Shoe Company, the General Shoe Corporation, one of the biggest in this country. He went on to do all of these things, but he was the kind of fellow that would carry him out, they would drive him out to the road, and he found out if the bus stopped out there, they would charge him a nickel more than if he went to the store down at the creek. So he had them drive him to the creek, but save a nickel. And then he died, and his wife was the most elegant lady that anybody has ever seen. She was able to talk the state into buying Craigfont and building and protecting a beautiful rock building. She had some influence in the rock castle at Hendersonville. And one day, sometime right before she dies, if she's still in her 90s, she came to a group of us and told us that she had bought Rosemont. Rosemont is a most unusual brick house, 7/10 of a mile off the public square south, that any of you have ever seen. She told us that she had bought it for $150,000. This is 15, 20 years ago. And that she would give the first $50,000 and that we could build an organization that would get up 50 of it, and that she was assured that the city would pay the other $50,000 to restore this house. Now, she was able to do that. If any of y'all ever met her, you would have a picture of her in your mind forever. One day in the Rotary Club, I was carrying two Indians from India around. They were Rotarians, and I just was showing them the town, and I had to show them this place because it was the biggest plantation in the country. And so I drove in the driveway and met her coming out. She was 92 years old. The two Indians got out and met her and talked to her, and she said, "I'm on my way to Nashville." And they got back in the car and they said, "You mean that 92-year-old lady is going to Nashville in that car?" I said, "Yes, sir." And not but a few weeks ago, she got a ticket for driving too fast down the interstate. But she was that kind of lady, and she ran this place. And after Mr. Weems died, and then she lived on to be 105, is that right? Yeah. 105 years old in the house. I think she would be amazed at what has happened to it. The house generally looks exactly like it did. The inside of it was pretty well destroyed historically, but we still have the outside that looks so much like the other. Gallatin and Hendersonville and Portland and the other few towns of Sumner County have exploded in the last few years, and here we are today trying to get enough roads, enough schools, and enough other facilities for all of the people that we have here. I hope you would enjoy coming to the historical sites of Sumner County, Rock Castle in Hendersonville, Craig Font, Wynwood, which is the largest log house open to the public in this part of the country, and to Rosemont and to the Fort site. All are interesting places to go, but the museum kind of covers it all. I hope y'all have enjoyed this, and I'm open for whatever the judge says.
First let me ask Walter, is the Adelicia sold got her cotton to New Orleans and sold it in England? Yes. What reported amount of money did she get?
I've forgotten. I don't remember, Joe.
Okay, I didn't know whether there was a factual to say $1 million, but that's what I've heard.
What's this?
The cotton that Adelicia got through the block.
I'm not sure what she did, but she was able to bribe the Union blockade forces at New Orleans to let her cotton get out of the river. And she bribed them and got that cotton out and got the money and did a lot of entertaining in Washington, D.C. So she was quite a lady now. That's all it is to it.
We don't know how much she netted out of that.
Right,
Because she had
that's
a lot
what
of
we don't know.
But she used to bribe them with either.
What I'd ask you to do is to relate some stories that exist concerning owners and people, even people on the plantation, whether you know that they're true or untrue. You can make a determination if you believe it. Yes, Don.
Thank you, Judge. This Ellen Williams was one of the most beautiful, mentally incapacitated people I have ever known. I went to get the mail one day, and Miss Ellen walked up to me, this has been 40 years ago, and she said, "Don, have you got a 50-cent piece I can borrow? Not a half a dollar, a 50-cent piece like they used back in the 1800s when she was born. I said, yes, ma'am, and I handed her a half a dollar. 15 minutes later, I looked out the window of my house, and she was barreling up my driveway, must have been doing 40 or 50 miles an hour. Come to pay me back that 50-cent piece. Then when I was senator, she walked into my office one day and she said, Senator, I want you to change the speed limit. 65 miles an hour. I said, Miss Ellen, why do you want me to change the speed limit down here? And she said, I got a ticket. I said, you got a ticket? How fast were you going? I was only doing 90. She was 90-something, 92 at that time, wasn't it? And they stopped her from driving that day morning. She was one of the most wonderful people and helped this community more than anyone. She was great.
Any stories come to mind? We can also accept them from the audience, if you have a story.
Judge, one day I stopped in an old-fashioned filling station in Gallatin to get my car filled up, and I stepped inside to sign the check, and the shortwave radio inside the station was on, and I heard this voice, and it said it was a patrol officer's voice, and he said, warn everybody, Miss Ellen Weems is going north on St. Blaise Road.
Bill?
The great thing that allowed Miss Ellen to live here alone at her age was that the entire community of Gallatin was protective of Miss Ellen. She was like their mother. In fact, she had Christmas dinner with us every Christmas, and she was godmother to our grandchild named Ellen. But I happened to go to church with her at that time, and her son Livingfield would normally come up to make sure that she didn't drive. And she would meet with a friend to have dinner every Sunday. So this particular Sunday, I asked her, Miss Ellen, where is Livingfield? Well, Livy couldn't make it today, but said, I'm driving myself. I said, oh. So I followed her out of the church parking lot up on Hartsville Pike, and it was like watching the Red Sea part, the traffic. She didn't just go down the middle, she went down the left-hand side and weaved. And we were getting into town, and the Baptists were letting out, and I prayed, oh Lord. And then we had the Methodists to go through too. But somehow Providence kept people from walking across the street at that particular time. And she went too far, and I knew she was confused, so I overtook her and got her turned around. But her driving was legendary. And I remember Miss Alice Calgary, who was a well-known figure here, rode to Nashville with her one time. And she did something and cut in front of some fella. And as often happens today, he leaned out the window and unleashed a string of curses at Miss Ellen. And Miss Alice Calgary, who was a member of this hunt club, said she just rolled down the window and just looked at him like that and took every word out and never flinched. Miss Ellen didn't hear a word.
I've got to tell one, though.
Good.
I'm 20-odd years old, digging dirt right out of the middle of the water right out there and putting it up here around these buildings. And the old bulldozer I had was worn out, and I was working on it. And Mr. Weems, it was 5 o'clock in the evening, and Mr. Weems drove up with his chauffeur. And in those days, he had quit driving. And he got out and asked me how I was getting along and what I needed to do. And I told him I'd get it fixed and get through in the morning. And he just turned around and said, John, do you need any money? I said, yes, it'd help. And he just turned around and wrote me a check on the hood of his car and handed it to me and got in his car and drove off.
there is a story. There was an ice house
Yeah,
on the property.
still is.
It's still there. You know where it is. And my understanding is that she grew mushrooms
Yeah.
in that. And what happened to her one time?
I don't know. I don't remember that one.
She wanted to check on her mushroom crop, and this was about midday, and there was an old rickety ladder going down 30 feet then into this well where they would normally cut, the Franklins would cut ice out of the river and save it for cold drinks and making ice cream in the summer in straw. But she descended the ladder, and about halfway down the ladder broke, and she fell, fortunately, into the mushroom spawn, and she didn't break anything. That was soon after they moved here. So she had to spend the afternoon among the spiders and the snakes down there until Mr. Will got home and heard this weak voice issuing from the depths that after he looked around, and they managed to get her out. But she was always adventuresome. She flew in the first airplane in Nashville, first car, first balloon. She marched for women's suffrage. She lived in 3 centuries. She saw Halley's Comet twice. And she was an encouragement to us all. About Mr. Will's careful spending habits, I like to think of a story of Commodore Bradford, who was a bond salesman at Equitable Securities, and he said he was walking up through the arcade, which, by the way, Miss Ellen owned. And there was Mr. Will in the shoe shop, and he had one shoe in there. And he said, Mr. Will, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm getting a half sole on the shoe. And he said, just one shoe? And he said, just one shoe had a hole in it.
Yes.
Also, she was one of the first young, older women to ski on this lake. Now, she actually skied on this lake in 1950s and kept a boat down there that she ran up and down the lake and fished.
Okay. Yes, sir. Just stand up so we can see and you speak.
I want to verify this and then tell you a story about it. You can tell me the validity. Who became Adelicia Ackland? Married, went to Nashville and married an Ackland. Did I hear one of you say that?
That was Adelicia Franklin.
Adelicia Franklin, and she became Adelicia Ackland. Now, you can just throw me out the window here, maybe. My grandmother, who would be 116 today, I guess, told us for years and years that Adelicia Ackland, on her second marriage to an Ackland, she had 3 stepchildren, and that she murdered them with poison. And that her husband, when she died, made an everlasting monument to her that's in the city cemetery today, where there's 3 little children, and she has her hand out with 3 little mimicking pills. Have you all heard that story?
Yes, that story has gone around for a long time. I first heard it when I just joined the Air Force in World War II. I heard it from a woman in Nashville. But that really didn't happen. When her husband died, she had his body and the children who had died exhumed from the big mausoleum at Fairvue and taken to Mount Olivet and put in the Ackland. It's a small mausoleum, really. It's just a many vaulted place, and then there is a statue, as you suggested, that first look, it looks like somebody is pouring, issuing some pills into something, but that story has been around a long time, but I don't think there's any real possibility that it was true. But it's a good story.
Children, not her stepchildren, weren't they?
Yeah, they were her
They were
children.
natural
Yes,
children.
that's correct. Not stepchildren.
Born here.
Miss Ellen, excuse me, Miss Ellen called us, Anna and me, one night and it was a miserable night. I mean, it was sleeting and trying to snow and blowing, and there was an open house over at Goodlettsville at the Bowen Camel historical house. So Miss Ellen said, are you all going to, no, she said, are you invited over to the Bowen Camel house tonight? I said, well, yes, we are. She said, well, I said, would you mind stopping and picking me up? And I'd like to ride. I said, well, you didn't say no to Miss Ellen easily. So we said yes, and I got in the car and went down to the house, and I went inside to escort Miss Ellen out and get her in the car. And as we went out the door, she shouted back over her shoulders to her caretaker, a caregiver, and she said, don't wait up for me. He said, we'll probably be late tonight. And we were the last ones to leave.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that Miss Ellen tried to give the plantation to the state
Yes, yes,
and the state refused?
yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, couldn't afford it.
At that time, they were asking you to put up a certain amount of money to help maintain it, and she was not willing to do that. Is that right now?
Yeah, that's right. And because it would have been a lot of money, because the maintenance of this whole facility here, was a big deal, and the state at that time was not. In fact, she also tried to give it to the Episcopal Church, working out some kind of arrangement, hoping that they could work out an arrangement to keep it, but that didn't work out either. She really hated not to be able to leave it where it would be cared for forever.
One time at Craig Font, they were trying to raise money out there, and Ms. Weems got up in the meeting and said, oh, we can raise strawberries out here and sell them.
Yes, sir. John? Thank you.
I suppose, Mr. Durham, would you tell us a little bit about the famous racehorse, St. Blaise?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, John.
Could you tell us a little bit about the famous racehorse, St. Blaise?
Oh, yeah, St. Blaise, we're now in the Reed era of ownership at Fairvue. St. Blaise was a phenomenal winner in Eastern race courses, and was a stallion, and so Reed decided he wanted to buy him and bring him down here and let him sire horses, and then they'd take those horses up to Saratoga Springs and sell them, because St. Blaise had a fantastic reputation. Then at that time, the owner of the horse, one of the Belmonts, I believe, John, owed Reed a $100,000 gambling debt. And so Reed determined that the notes he had for the debt would be redeemed if he furnished the money to do it. So he bought the horse. They opened bidding, and someone bid $50,000, and Reed jumped to $100,000, and that scared everybody else off. He got the horse for the gambling debt, and then brought the horse here, and the horse disappointed. He just he sired foals, but he didn't sire anybody who could run. But it was a well-known horse of the period. Then the fact that he was sold for $100,000 was a big deal, even at that time.
Yes, sir.
Got a quick question on the Civil War. Ebenezer Payne, Earl Marshal, was here. There's some awful stories about what went on. Could you maybe, Mr. Durham or John, mention some of the examples of what he did?
Who's this?
Ebenezer
General Payne.
You don't
Payne.
get us started on him.
We don't.
This has been
We
very civil
don't
group
discuss General Payne. He was an absolute tyrant in this part of the country, and so he killed people with no reason at all. And he controlled things. He stole things and shipped them home. But he was finally held responsible for that and tried, and I'm not sure what happened to the trial, but he was tried for stealing and other things.
He was tried by court-martial, but it was late in the war, and when the war ended, they suspended all court-martial trials that had not been completed. So he lucked out.
Had a question over here, Tom.
Yes.
Yeah, there's an old cemetery, what's the remnants of a cemetery, on the other side of 31 by the college that L.A. Green had restored. Can you give us any of the history about who's buried there, or what's what the history of that is?
That was a Payton Cemetery, and you can read about that in Walter's book on Bailey Payton. But that was the Payton Cemetery. It was a pretty good-sized cemetery. One of the owners of that property years ago took the stones down and pushed them against the fence and turned the hogs into the area. Later on, the family came back and put up another monument and moved it around. The Greens had a chance to sell it a few years ago, that property, which they didn't work out. And we got together and moved the cemetery up the road a little piece and moved, it was about 30 graves.
Yeah.
You mentioned Walter's book, and we've covered so many things just touching the high spots today. But out in the lobbies, you'll find all Walter's books. Don writes fictional books. You'll find the books that Jack Masters and I have worked on for 8 years that covers all this, plus Ms. Dwelly's art and some other artists out there. And we are going to be very happy, always are, to answer any questions you may have. Whether we give you the right answer or not, we'll show. It shows how far arrogance can carry ignorance.
Before we leave, I've got to tell you my favorite story. When somebody comes in here from Texas to visit, I always tell them this story. And that in 1830, of course, that was when Texas was fighting for its independence. Sam Houston had left here to go down there, and so did Crockett. And so many young men left this part of the country, and so many of them from Sumner County, to go to Texas and fight with their kinfolks that had moved down there a decade or 10, 20 years before, that they raised the intelligence of both states. But there's one more that we're told here today that I have to repeat, and I could point him out, but I won't. He says he's from up north, and somebody said, a Yankee? He said, no, I'm a apprenticed hillbilly.
All of us, the three of us here, are all from Gallatin. And years ago, I was at the State Library in Nashville doing some research, and one of the librarians came up to me and said, Mr. here is something that you might be interested in. I really wasn't, but I politely took it and looked at it. It was a book published in London, England, in 1820. And it was a gazetteer, that is just listed, it was an American gazetteer, listed towns and counties and states, and with a little line or two identifying each one of the towns or counties. And I said, well, Gallatin, it won't be listed in there, but Nashville will be. So I looked up Nashville, and sure enough, Nashville, Tennessee, and here's what it said: an important Cumberland River port 25 miles south of Gallatin.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Downtown near the courthouse, there's a plaque commemorating the first recruitment of black soldiers in Tennessee.
Yeah.
I take it they were free blacks?
No, not necessarily. The Emancipation Proclamation had already affected this part of the country by that time.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't include Tennessee because it was regarded as being still held by the Federals. And so these former slaves, these black men were recruited on the promise that the Union Army would take care of their families while they were gone. And they got the recruits, but they didn't take care of the families. And that was really a bad deal for the community and for the families and for the soldiers.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to explain to some of you about.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
I'd like to explain to some of y'all why the Civil War was such a problem to solve. You realize that the two, North and South, were divided and were struggling with slavery. But let's look at the problems that it caused. We'll take Mr. Franklin, for instance. He went to Louisiana, and for $1 an acre, he could buy 1,000 acres or more. And he did. He bought lots of it. He bought colored people to go down there and run those places, slaves. And they were costing him between $500 and $1,000, depending on their age and so forth. So you can look real quick that it took 100 slaves to work the 1,000 acres, we'll say. And you can say that 500 times, or his net worth was not in the land that was all he would have after freeing of the slaves, but in the slaves themselves. So all of those slave owners all over the country had their money, their profit, their net worth was in slaves. So they fought to try to protect something that we all know was wrong. And so you have to think about that. Your net worth might be in your house and so forth, but if your net worth is something that the government or the times were going to just take away from you, then you had a problem. And that was the problem of slavery.
Go right ahead. Yes.
Yeah, we were up in Alexandria a couple years ago, and it turns out that there is a museum dedicated pretty much to Armitage and Isaac Franklin, and not in a positive sense. It's a fairly grisly little museum, which essentially shows how people were transported, how they were treated, how many of them didn't live, what happened to them when they got here. And, it's actually a sort of a sad side of our history. In a sense, it's kind of a shame that we have a street named after Armitage and Isaac Franklin. Armfield. Anyway, if you're ever up in Alexandria, you might stop and just take a look at that museum. Don't tell them you're here.
Okay. We've gone past one. Oh, Don.
Yes, sir. Concerning the slaves here in Gallatin, Sumner County, a lot of people don't know this, but when the war was over and the slaves were freed, and they were told that they could leave and go wherever they wanted to go, they were free people, they chose to stay right here on these farms and continue working the farms. In fact, Fairvue Plantation was one of the first farms in the state of Tennessee that paid their former slaves a wage to continue working, and it worked fine.
Okay. Since we started late, we ran over a little bit, and we do appreciate everyone's attendance, and hopefully you learned some facts about Fairvue. Thank you.